Hey everyone, Mulligan here, and welcome to my Legendary Crafting Guide series. If you're new to the game or just getting into Constructed, you're probably wondering what legendaries you need to craft first. This series is aimed towards answering that question for you. Because of that, we'll be focusing on a single two-color faction for each video. I want to be as informative as possible with the cards I'll be talking about, since I feel that going fairly in-depth for each card and giving a little history on how they've been used in different metagames will help you guys just starting out that want to focus on crafting legendaries for a particular deck. I'll only be focusing on popular decks for these videos, and within each archetype, I'll be talking about the essential legendaries, which you should always craft first, and then the optional legendaries, which are cards that occasionally find their way into some decks, but are usually metagame dependent. Any legendary I don't mention is either highly experimental, doesn't fit the general game plan of the popular decks you would see, or is just plain bad. Rakano's up first, so let's jump in. So I want to talk about the legendaries that would fit into your Rakano aggro decks first, and Rakano aggro is going to encompass Rakano plate decks, Oathbook decks, and Rakano burn decks. So as far as essential legendaries goes, the only essential one is actually Deep Forge Plate. This is a 5 power weapon requiring 2 fire and 2 justice influence to play. When you equip it on a unit, it gains +5/+5 and gets overwhelm and endurance. So this is the card where Rakano Plate gets its namesake from. There is no Rakano Plate without Deep Forge Plate. This should be the very first legendary you craft for aggro decks before any of the other ones on this list. The only Rakano aggro deck that wouldn't run this card is the very rarely seen Rakano Burn, and you can still make a case for this card there. This is going to top out your curve pretty much every time in an aggro deck, so if you're aiming to build a Rakano aggro deck, I would craft 3 copies of these, and honestly recommend 4 if you plan to bring the deck to a tournament setting. So as far as optional legendaries goes, we have Soulfire Drake, Eugene Imperial Armor, and Navona War Singer. So let's first talk about Soulfire Drake. This is a 5 power 5/2 unit requiring 3 fire influence to play. It has flying and charge and entomb, so when this dies, each unit in your deck randomly gets flying or charge. One quick note for those new, if this dies and you have units in your deck that already have flying, they will automatically gain charge, and vice versa. Soulfire Drake is commonly seen in Stone Scar decks, not Rakano decks. But the reason why I have Soulfire Drake listed here is because if you plan to go into a tournament setting that allows sideboards with an aggressive Rakano deck, you will probably want some copies of these. I've seen people run anywhere between 2 to 4 copies of this card between their main deck and sideboard in a given meta. Along with Deep Forge Plate, this usually rounds out the top of your curve, meaning it'll be the most expensive thing you will play in a given game. Again though, when it comes to Rakano, Soulfire Drakes are for tournaments only. If you're just laddering, this is definitely an optional legendary. Next card I want to talk about is Eugene Imperial Armor, a 3 power 3/2 unit requiring 2 fire and 1 justice influence to play. You may pay 4 and exhaust Eugene to play a +4/+4 mithril armor on another one of your units. So this card was looked down upon for a long time, but continuous refinements to Rakano aggro have put Eugene in the spotlight, and she can sometimes be found in certain versions of the deck. Because she can use her ability every turn, if she is not taken care of, she will run away with the game. That said, Eugene is not a staple by any means for Rakano aggro decks, and usually only 2 copies of the card are run at the most, if at all. The last card I want to talk about is Navona War Singer, a 4 power 4/4 unit requiring 1 fire and 1 justice influence to play. She has War Cry, and Navoni's War Cry affects each unit and weapon in your deck. So Navona has an extremely powerful effect that benefits every Rakano deck in the meta right now, theoretically. But her biggest problem is getting that effect to go off before she dies. If she is not immediately dealt with, she can run away with the game, similar to Ijin, but not quite, since Ijin's ability immediately affects the board if she lives, whereas Navani is a future investment. That said, Navani either gets killed or silenced often enough to keep players away from her, and even when she isn't, there's some bigger unit usually standing in her way ready to block and kill her. I'll go ahead and mention this right now, so I won't have to talk about Navani later on. She can find a place in a very specific version of Armory, that being Aggro Armory, where you may want 4 copies of her, but she isn't even a staple there. Navani should never be crafted until you have every other Rakano legendary that you need for your deck, whether that's Rakano Aggro or Armory. She's still just a card you want to experiment with, as she has yet to find a permanent home in any deck where she can be effective. So that's it for all the legendaries that you would want to look into crafting for your Rakano Aggro decks. Before we move on though, I want to give a quick honorable mention to Jack the Bounty Hunter, a 6 power, 6/4 unit requiring 1 fire and 1 justice influence to play. He's got quick draw and a summon ability where when he comes into play, you silence and stun an enemy unit. This is another card that people initially wrote off until it started seeing use in Ikaria Gold, courtesy of Toth. Hasn't been seen much since then, but it pops up occasionally in variants of Rakano that lean towards more of a mid-range deck. But the great thing about this one is that you don't need to craft these. You can just earn them through the Jack's Bounty campaign, and it's the last reward you get for beating the final boss. So let's move on to the legendaries that you should consider crafting if you're trying to build an Armory style deck. And this is going to encompass traditional Armory, aggressive Armory, Ikaria Blue and Ikaria Gold, and the new Blue Armory decks that have been popping up recently. So the essential legendaries are Starsteel Daisho and Cardia the Liberator. So let's start with Daisho first. Starsteel Daisho is a 6 power, 4/4 relic weapon. It requires 2 fire and 2 justice influence to play. And while you have this equipped, your avatar can attack twice each turn. So this is the very first legendary you need to craft for most Armory style decks before any other legendary I mentioned on this list. This relic weapon will end the game very quickly if not dealt with, especially if you can buff it with other cards. You can sometimes remove multiple units with it if you manage to give it enough armor, or even bring it back with Smuggler Stash. All that being said, even though Daisho is a staple card for traditional Armory, you should only craft 2 copies for that deck. You typically don't need 4 copies, since Armory also runs Rise to the Challenge to search for this card, and Smuggler Stash to bring the card back from the void. Historically, Ikaria Blue and Ikaria Gold have been built more like control decks with less focus on relic weapons, so Daisho never actually stuck as a staple in those decks, and in the case of Ikaria Gold, never even made it in. However, Aggro Armory and the new Blue Armory decks do use this card as well, so if you want to go that route, I would craft 2 copies for those decks too. Ikaria the Liberator, the other essential legendary, a 7 power 5/5 unit. Requiring 3 fire and 3 justice influence to play. She's got flying, endurance, Warcry 5, charge, and Aegis. An amazing card for nearly every style of Armory deck. Ikaria ends games, she's tough to remove cleanly, and even if you do, she makes the next unit or weapon you draw a game ender. However, since she costs 7, she has never been found as a 4 in any serious deck. Aggro Armory actually doesn't want her at all. But when it comes to traditional Armory, she's perfect. I personally would always craft 2 copies of her, so you can draw her somewhat consistently if needed. But because Armory runs cards like Rise to the Challenge and Smuggler Stash, plenty of people have gotten away with only running 1 copy. So if you can only craft 1, that's fine. Also, Cardia should only be crafted before Daisho for decks like Ikaria Blue or Gold, since you won't be running Daisho in those typically. So on to the optional legendaries, and there's really only one on this list, that being Sword of the Sky King, an 8 power 8/8 relic weapon requiring 2 justice influence to play. This is a pretty good card that cleaves through any of the popular units in the current metagame if they aren't buffed. But 8 power is a lot to pay, so Aggro Armory doesn't want this card either. Traditional Armory generally doesn't play this card because their other weapons do just fine when buffed. Historically, this card has found its way into some Icaria Blue and Icaria Gold lists, since you don't necessarily need to buff this weapon for it to be good, but I've never seen more than 1 copy in a typical list. If you're going for those type of decks, I would craft a single copy of this card only if you already have a few copies of Icaria. Starsteel Daisho is far more important for traditional Armory than this is. I would just never craft more than 1 copy of this card in general, and only after you've crafted the necessary copies of every other legendary on this list for Armory. I don't think the meta will ever be allowed to be slow enough to where you need 2 or more copies of these going forward, but I could be wrong. But that's it for the Rakano portion of the Legendary Crafting Guide. Hopefully I've pointed you guys in the right direction if you're just starting out. If you liked the video, feel free to give it a like. If you have any suggestions or just general feedback, let me know in the comments section below. Also, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the future videos, not just for this series, but for the other Eternal content I put out as well. Thanks for taking time out of your day to watch this, and I'll see you all soon. Take care.